All right, so it is 11:31, so we'll go ahead and get started as people continue to join us. Wheat. Consumers think of it simply as an ingredient that goes into their bread or other baked goods. But farmers such as Jim Moseley and Dan DeSetter know that it's so much more than that. Including a wheat crop in the rotation has provided these two the opportunity to improve their soil health, save on input costs, and get additional grazing value from their row crop fields. Hello everyone, and thanks for joining us for our virtual field day, Wheat, a gateway crop to soil health, resilience, and more. My name is Rebecca Clay, and I'm with Practical Farmers of Iowa. And helping us out to run the tech for this field day is Phoebe Eichhorst. And PFI's very own Alicia Bauer will be presenting some economics findings later on in this field day. Practical Farmers of Iowa is based, you guessed it, out of Iowa, and so we're really thankful to our partners from the other I state in the Midwest, Indiana. Michael O'Donnell of Purdue Organic Agriculture Program and Joe Rourke of Indiana's Conservation Cropping Systems Initiative have been essential partners in planning for and preparing for this virtual field day. I also want to thank our sponsor for this specific event. Pipeline Foods is a sponsor for all of our virtual field days, but has specifically sponsored this field day. And Pipeline Foods is accelerating the availability and reliability of organic, non-GMO, and regeneratively grown food. Pipeline Foods brings transparent, sustainable supply chain solutions to connect the dots for our farming partners and end users of organic grains and ingredients. Additionally, the sponsors listed here have helped to make these virtual field days possible. With their support, Practical Farmers of Iowa is able to put on over 60 virtual field days this season. These field days are online, broadcasting to you in the comfort of your air-conditioned home, office, or shop. And best of all, they're completely free. So be sure to check out our additional events on Practical Farmers of Iowa's website. And again, we thank these sponsors for their support. And of course, a field day wouldn't be a field day without some promotion on behalf of the host organization. Practical Farmers of Iowa is a farmer-led nonprofit based out of Ames, Iowa. We specialize in farmer-to-farmer knowledge sharing and farmer-led research. We invite you to learn more about our organization and check out some of our resources at practicalfarmers.org. But before we begin, we're just going to briefly go over some housekeeping items. So this field day is going to last an hour and a half, going until 1 p.m. Central Time and 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And over this hour and a half, we'll hear from speakers Jim Moseley, Dan DeSetter, and Alicia Bauer. And we want to make this field day as interactive as possible, despite the fact that we are virtual. So we invite you to ask questions throughout, and we'll be pausing throughout to do some Q&A with you, and then we'll also have some Q&A at the very end. And finally, we ask you to provide some feedback on this virtual field day. Once you close out of Zoom, a dialog box will appear on your device with a link to fill out the evaluation. And we ask that you just take a minute or two to fill this out so that PFI can continue to improve our programming. Next, I want to go over the two ways that you can be interactive with us and ask questions. We're going to do this in two ways. The first one is via the chat box. And you can access the chat box by hovering your mouse over the bottom of your screen until this black bar appears. And then you can click on this chat icon until the chat box appears. Once it appears, we ask you to change this blue field from all panelists to all panelists and attendees, just so that we're all able to see the questions that you're asking and not just us hosts. So to practice that, let's all just go ahead and click on the chat box and change from all panelists to all panelists and attendees. And type your name and type where you're watching from so we can get an idea of who's all joining us for this field day. And while you're doing that, I want to go over the second option for asking questions. The second option is to click this raise hand option, and then on our end, we'll be able to unmute you so that we can actually hear your questions verbalized aloud. So we ask you to save those for the specific Q&A time periods, and then the chat box you can just use throughout the entire event. All right, at this point, I'd like to invite Joe to tell us a little bit about CCSI, and then Michael, you can tell us a little bit about the Purdue Organic Agriculture Program.
Absolutely, thanks, Becca. and thanks everybody for having us, and thanks for joining us. Like I said, I'm Joe Rorick, and I'm the agronomist for the Conservation Cropping Systems Initiative here in Indiana. And our mission is to improve soil health on Indiana cropland. Next slide, please. We do that principally through our core 4 principles here of minimizing disturbance, maximizing soil cover, maximizing biodiversity, and maximizing living roots through as much of the year as you can. And of course, wheat is a great way to do that, acting a lot like a cover crop, but in the next spring or early summer, you get to harvest that and make some more money. And Alicia will talk a little bit about that later. Next slide, please. So here's my contact information, and here's CCSI's contact information. Please join us on our website at ccsin.org. We have a calendar of all the soil health events that we know about going on, principally in Indiana, but we do have all over the country as well if we know about them. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we're on, I think it's Instagram there. I don't know my social media very well. That's definitely not my wheelhouse. But we do have a Flickr account with some stock photos and stuff too. And please feel free to email us at info@ccsin.org, or of course there's my email up there as well. And thanks everybody for joining us again.
All right, thank you, Joe. Michael, you can tell us a little bit about the work that you do as well.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, yeah, as you mentioned, I'm Michael O'Donnell. I work with Purdue Extension in a kind of a unique statewide capacity as an organic and diversified agriculture educator. And in that role since late 2016, I've been working to develop and coordinate an organic agriculture extension program to better serve organic farmers, those transitioning acreage to organic, and the broader organic industry here in the state of Indiana. A lot of that work, just based on demand, opportunity, the questions that are coming my way, is working with grain farmers, those who are currently managing organic acreage, transitioning acreage, or exploring that opportunity and what that might mean for their farm. So to accomplish that, there's a lot of one-on-one support that I provide to farmers. So essentially one-on-one technical support, education, consulting, helping them think through how to transition acreage, but then also creating a lot of opportunities for education that you think of with extension in terms of workshops, conferences, field days, things like that. But I think most importantly, a lot of my work has been as a facilitator here in Indiana and creating connections between farmers and those in the industry so that they can learn from one another and kind of grow the organic community here in the state of Indiana. Right there, that's what's on your screen. You can see the homepage of the Purdue Extension Organic Agriculture website. We just recently revamped that with some new content and hopefully a little bit better organized so you can find that content and connect with me. So I want to thank Practical Farmers for bringing me and Joe with CCSI into this effort, and also thank Jim Moseley for hosting and working with us on this, and for Dan for his involvement. So thanks.
All right, thank you so much, Michael. And last but certainly not least, I would like to introduce our generous hosts. First up on the docket, we'll be hearing from Jim Moseley. And Jim farms near Clarks Hill, Indiana, and he uses soil building practices, which he'll delve into in great detail in a bit. In addition to his career as a farmer, Jim has also served as the Deputy Secretary in DC at the US Department of Ag from 2001 to 2009. And so we're really happy to have you joining us, Jim, and thank you for sharing your expertise with us. Following Jim, we'll hear from Dan DeSutter, who farms near Attica, Indiana. And Dan has gone above and beyond simply extending his crop rotation and soil health improvement, and is integrating livestock into his row crop production. So we're also very excited to learn from you too, Dan. And without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Jim first, and then Dan, who are hanging out on Jim's farm today. Take it away, Jim. Jim, sorry, just a second. We can't hear you. Do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
I just figured that out. I was getting the signal.
Perfect.
We're going to have some fun today. and that's important in everything we do in life, I think. I can be philosophical about that at my age. And this is a lot better, I will tell you, setting out here dressed like this than it would be setting in Washington, D.C. at this moment in an office. I can't imagine what that town is like right now. So it's truly a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to have all of you with us here in West Central Indiana. We found a beautiful day. The only thing that we're having difficulty with is the sweat peas are quite abundant, but I just found out that they're important in taking care of aphids. So even they become a blessing to us in a different way. I also want to thank PFI, and I'm going to have more to say about this organization a little bit later on and its significance. And of course, Purdue University. I'm an alumni of Purdue, and we appreciate much what Michael is doing here, helping producers in Indiana learn a better way to going about farming. I think it's important to give you a little bit of background, maybe a philosophical viewpoint. I think that's always important for people to understand what's behind the speaker and what are they thinking about. First of all, conservation started with me when I was a little pup. My grandfather was a conservationist, my father likewise. But I remember my grandfather coming and get me frequently, and we had to go out and plant trees. And we planted trees, and we planted trees. It seemed like every spring he had a new project. And I learned the early parts of conservation from him. Kath and I graduated from Purdue in 1970, and we found this farm. We did not go back to our home farms. Kathy came from farm, I did too. We did not go back to home farms. We found a farm here in southern Tippecanoe County. It was 250 acres of land and had some livestock, mainly hogs. And we got started farming. And we had a lot to learn. I came off of a farm, but still, there was a lot that needed to be learned in the process. And I met an individual by the name of David Swaim, who pulled into my driveway in 1977. And Dave had been at Purdue as well, and he had been out working in the industry and had taken a position with Brookside Labs. And David started working with me on fertility in 77. And we learned that we were not doing all the things that we needed to do correctly, and the learning process was on its way. And David worked us through a number of years, and his focus also was on soils and what we needed to do in terms of improving soils, because what we were finding was in the process that we were using, which was conservation tillage using a chisel plow and a field cultivator and then planting, we were getting a fair amount of compaction. And David thought that we ought to be looking at some of the alternative technologies. In 1983, we ended up going to ridge till, and then after 3 or 4 years of that, we evolved into no-till. I left the farm in 1989. Quite unexpectedly, I got an offer to go to Washington, D.C. And first I worked for the administrator of EPA, working on agriculture. And then I became the undersecretary of NRE, where I had soil conservation and forest service. And my initial issue with the forest service was managing the spotted owl. And that was quite a transition for this individual coming from the heart of corn, soybean country into looking at forest issues, and especially trying to manage an endangered species issue in the Pacific Northwest. but also had soil conservation service. And the thing that we had to do there was manage conservation compliance. And out of that, when we'd go out and we talk to farmers, they say, you know, this no-till thing, we know it meets conservation compliance, but you know, we don't have the capital to go and buy no-till equipment. And so I took that thought, came home, realizing that we needed some kind of an incentive program. I have to admit, at that time, I thought federal policy was the ticket. This was a way that we were going to go out across the landscape and we were going to do the kinds of things that we were doing today if we could just get federal policy correct. I was wrong. In 1994, I was asked if I'd be the director of agriculture here in Indiana. And that was fortuitous because I chaired a committee on natural resources since that's what I had done when I was in DC the first time. And we were able to work through an incentive program in our process within the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture, a concept called EQIP. And I actually spent a lot of time in DC working with NASA, went to the Hill, got the political support that we needed. And as a result of that activity, the EQIP concept came into being. And initially it was all about soil improvement. And really it was about helping those farmers get the cash needs in order to buy the equipment that they needed to carry that out. Again, it was all about soil improvement. Then it was about 6 years later, I was minding my own business here on the farm and getting along fine. And we had expanded our livestock operation substantially, and the farm was a sufficient size. So we had several employees and managers, and I was called out of the clear blue on a January morning as I was walking the hog barns and got an invitation to come out and speak with the new Secretary of Agriculture, Ann Venom. And I knew Ann. She knew me, and she asked me if I'd come out and interview and consider being Deputy Secretary of Agriculture. So I did that. But when I went back, again, I still had this concept about policy. And EQIP had changed a lot. It had broadened a lot. It was doing a lot of things besides soil improvement. So I thought, we need another program, right? I came up with the concept called CSP. And it's a long and interesting story of which I'll not go into. But we finally, at the 11th hour and the 59th minute in the 2002 Farm Bill, EQIP was signed into law. So again, the idea with EQIP was to get back to our roots, get back to the soil improvement. I went through that process and I came home and was thinking about it. And I have to say what that experiment taught me after I saw EQIP, I saw CSP become functional, was that it's not policy really that's going to get us where we need to go. It's farmer understanding. And so the question is, how do we go about improving farmer understanding? And what I'm talking about is farmers know how to grow a crop down to intimate details. But what many farmers still lack, I believe, is a complete understanding of that soil that is so important to them and what that soil really does. So I'm here farming. I'm doing fine. I'm thinking about things, and I get a chance then to co-chair an activity in 2010 called Agree, along with Dan Glickman, who was the former Secretary of Agriculture. And our primary purpose there was to try to figure out how we were going to feed 10 billion people the year 2050 and all the things that needed to happen within agriculture. And that really got me thinking, because we kept talking about genetics and we kept talking about technology. But the fact was that that was a two-legged stool that I knew was never going to stand. It was unstable. There was a third leg to that, and it had to be, as I looked at soils globally, it had to be soil health. And that terminology was beginning to be bandied around quite a bit, and I got caught up in it. And I began to understand that if we can do technology, we can do genetics, but unless we have soil, in 2050, we were going to have difficulty in agriculture feeding those people. So as a result of that experience and thinking, and Agree lasted for 8 years, so I had plenty of time to think about it and to work in the direction. By the way, Agree is still working today on this particular activity. I immersed myself in the regenerative ag issue, and the individuals go speak to you in just a little bit, Dan DeSutter. I called Dan, and we had an association through an activity that I chaired called the Eisenhower Fellowship, and Dan was actually one of our fellows who went to Australia and New Zealand and looked at soil issues and agriculture in that country, and came back and I think had really interesting perspectives, of which I've appreciated him sharing. I reached out to Dan. They said, hey, you know, this regenerative ag thing looks to me like it's something that we need to seriously be considering. And all of a sudden I realized, but I've got a farm and I ought to be doing this as well. So along in 2015, I began to think about how I was going to be a part of this in a much larger way. First thing I knew I had to do is I had to expand the rotation. I was corn soybean farmer, very conventional for this part of the world. It was all no-till. This farm's been no-tilled since 1983, essentially. But so I knew I needed to change the rotation, and we looked at wheat, and I remember saying to Dan, but you know, wheat won't make any money for me. And Dan's report back was, yes, but you can put that multi-species cover crop out there, you get a full season growth on it, and you'll be amazed at what will happen in the subsequent crops. So that was the first step. We went into rotation. I focused on biology, and particularly on mycorrhizal fungi. I had no idea how important fungi was in the soil and what its capabilities were in terms of communicating and moving nutrients through the soil. I learned, and I found out that it was important. I did a lot of digging during this time. And what I found was, in my no-till, I could dig down about 12 to 13 inches, and I was in really good shape. But at 13 inches, I was hitting a layer of compaction. And I talked to a friend of mine, Barry Fisher, and who's an NRCS fellow, and I said, Barry, this is what's going on. He said, that's kind of what we find in no-till. You'll have that good aggregate structure that deep, but below that you have this compaction. Well, what I began to understand is we need to do in the next 24 inches what we did in the top 12 inches of our soil layer. And mainly I began to understand the value of carbon and the ability to build it rather than just trying to maintain it, which I kind of understood we were doing with no-till, and we talked about no-till in terms of building carbon over time, but I realized from the evidence that was being presented that that's a very, very slow process. So we needed increase the speed of building that carbon. And of course, the regenerative process of putting cover crops on that land moved us several steps forward. And of course, where and when it's applicable for producers, if you can put livestock on there, grazing livestock, mob grazing, as Dan's going to talk about today, you really begin to accelerate the carbon process.
Hey, Jim,
So
I
you,
just want to keep us cognizant of time here. We're about 15 minutes through your 30-minute section, and we're also
you're
getting
doing
a little
good.
bit, just a little bit of wind feedback. So I don't know if you're able to position your chair so that the wind isn't right on your speaker. That would be great. And then maybe you could, why don't you just tell us a little bit about, your first year of growing wheat, how you got into that crop specifically, and kind of what your cover crop journey on your wheat fields has been.
This help.
Yeah, I think that sounds better. Thank you.
Okay, and that was exactly where I'm going. So with all that, we had to do something out in the field, and we started in with the rotation of wheat, and 2000 planted the wheat crop in 2017, and did our first full cover crop following that reed with multi-species in 2018. We had some problems, and I don't, if you can find the slide of wheat, you'll see a slide that, and I don't know if you're able to do that, but you'll find a slide there that where it shows some wheat looks really good, and then there's some wheat that's sharply curtailed in its growth. And what we found out was that when you apply your herbicides on soybeans, you can easily have carryover when you're planting a wheat crop, and we just simply weren't aware of it. We didn't have major issues on the entire crop, but we had areas where we had some pretty serious problems, and it was pursuit was the first thing that we worked with that caused us some difficulty, and then FlexStar ended up this last year causing us some, and we were kind of surprised by that, but it was an issue. I'll take a moment to mention one of the major challenges that we've had here in the last 2 to 3 years. We didn't have a water hemp on this farm, and all of a sudden 3 years ago water hemp began to show up, and it's one that's we're finding is it's going to be a little bit difficult to work with. I remember I hadn't grown wheat, and I had to learn a lot about just how you do that. I found out that nitrogen application is important whether you split it or you use a single application, and really the tillering of that wheat determines how you go about it. So you've got to get out on those fields, and you got to look closely. You got to take tiller counts and make a decision of how you're going to apply nitrogen. I had a little blip this past year on this particular wheat crop behind us. It was seeded, and I went to seed the rye cover crop that was going to go to beans. And when I came up to the wheat, as it's been seeded, I turned on the wheat to turn around, go back, and not realizing that the drill was going to dribble a little bit of rye. So I had some rye overseeding, and of course that was caused a little bit of problem with the processor where we were delivering the wheat product. Pricing was a challenge for me. I had never priced wheat, and wheat is different than corn and soybeans, different global conditions and so forth. And so I learned that, you got to pay attention to what's going on, just like you do in corn and soybeans, but wheat is different. and you watch different things. Plus, I found out this last year when you're pricing, you want to get everything in writing. We had a chance to sell this wheat for a 30 over basis, which locally we were getting 10 under. That was 40 cents. It was certainly worth shipping it a little bit further, but they told me that one day we harvested the wheat, the next day we delivered all of it in the same day, and when the check came, the 30 cents of it was gone, and in the process of that 24 hours, it had gone from 30 over to equal zero basis, and so the check was a little bit smaller than what I anticipated. So, you know, get things in writing. You'd think somebody my age would know that, but you know, these things happen even to those of us who have had a fair amount of experience. And the other thing, if you can find a slide on a wheat budget and put that up there. What did I do?
Yep, we have it up for you so that they can see
Okay,
it.
well, can you, if you'll bear with me just a second, I lost my Zoom thing. Sorry. Okay, yes, I see it. If you look at it, you'll see that it was a negative this year. That's the lowest negative that it's been. And the fact is that in this area of the country, it's just difficult for 80 or 90 bushel wheat to compete because of the soil types and their capacity to grow 240 bushel corn, 70, 75 bushel beans. It's really difficult for wheat to compete with corn and soybeans. So as I shared earlier, Dan told me, though, the issue is you just go ahead and you accept that loss because you'll get benefits on further down the road. And that's exactly the reason why I did it. I'm thinking about the long-term benefit that we can get from growing this wheat because of the ability to get that multi-species cover crop out there. The other thing that I also consider, and it's important to me, but I think it's more important maybe in the policy arena, is what it does to land value. If we improve these soils, there has to be some inherent growth and land value of that land. And this is one of the common things that I hear from farmers. Well, my landlord doesn't want me to do these kinds of practices. Well, the landlord will change their mind when they realize that their farm is worth 15 or 20 cents or 15 or 20% more in value than what it had previously been under the conventional kind of tillage programs. And I realized from my policy experience that we would never get to that 300 or 350 bushel corn crop, 80 to 100 bushel bean crop, as long as we continued with the current system that we have, conventional tillage and so forth. The only way we were going to get there was to get these cover crops on, get the soil protected, and get the microbes active in the soil and working for us. I guess it's kind of simplistic, but I think we can say that the soil can work, what the soil can do and work is directly related to how healthy it is. And the analogy would be an individual that's 35 years old. If they're good health, they can get a lot done. If they're in poor health, not much happens. So soils are exactly the same. It takes carbon. That's what we're working towards here. And carbon, of course, begets microbes. And we got to have diversity in that system to feed those microbes. That's where the multi-species cover crop comes in. When we do that, we're going to walk out in the field here just in a second, and we're going to take a look at, you begin to get an improvement in that aggregate structure. And that does a lot of things for us in terms of the ability of roots to work in the soil, the amount of air, oxygen that's there. And of course, the big one is the amount of water that we can both get into that soil, and we can also hold in that soil for later use. I think it's time to go out to the field. Yes, if you can, yeah, bring up a picture of the mix while we walk out to the field, and we'll do the rest of this talking from the field.
That sounds great. Jim, as you're walking out to the field, I guess I've got a question for you. You talked about having a multi-species mix for your cover crop. And so I'm wondering if you could kind of tell us more specifically what your goals with the cover crop are and how you chose what species to include in your mix.
Okay, well, the goal, of course, is to keep the soil covered all the time and keep living roots. And the idea on that is what kind of living roots. We're looking at a variety of things. And I think there's a slide there you might be able to put up that shows plants and their roots on the tailgate, if you can find that. But as you look at it, you'll see that some of those plants, things like sunflower, we don't have sun hemp in this mix this year, but it's good. You get deep rooting with the grasses. You get shallow rooting, but you're trying to kind of cover the waterfront as far as roots are concerned. And the important thing is you get a diversity of exudates from those roots. And it's that diversity of exudates that helps feed that microbial colony, and that becomes extremely important. Okay, we're here. If we can take a look, we have a variety of things here. We thought we'd pull a sample, and I got my friend Dan here. We're not being exactly socially concerned at the moment, but.
Jim, can you tell us a little bit about the cover crop that we're looking at? When did you harvest the wheat, and how did you seed this cover crop?
Yes.
How long ago did you seed it?
It was, we harvested the wheat on July 5th, and this got manure on it from a lagoon. I'm no longer in the pig business, but 4 years ago we closed it, and I had a lagoon here that I wanted to clean, and so we put some manure on this field, and then immediately got in here and planted a cover crop, and that was planted on, this was planted starting on July the 19th. And it was drilled with a Great Plains drill, fairly simple. Let's see what they're finding here. Yes.
What are we looking at, Jim?
Fungal. Dan, the little piece of soil that Dan pulled up there was fungal. Not root off the radish plant here. This is radish. This is Sudan. This is flax, and flax is very helpful in terms of the mycorrhizal connectivity. We have some clover that will likely overwinter, and there's some hemp in here. or I'm sorry, not hemp, vetch, which will likely overwinter as well. Most of this, though, is going to winter kill as soon as, because of the difficulty we're having here with water hemp, as soon as we get the first frost on this, I'll come in and put on a fairly heavy application, 40, 45 pounds of cereal rye, and we'll try to slip some radishes in there as well. Radishes won't get very big, but that taproot on the radish will go down at a fairly significant depth. This was seeded on July the 19th. Dan's got a really good Sudan. You've got Sudan, you got wheat, you got triticale, you got barley. Those are the grasses. They do different things than what the legumes and the brassicas do. If you might come here, if you can, Michael. I pulled a couple of samples this morning. This is a sample that's pulled from a field close to here that I don't do anything with, and you see how that kind of comes apart. This is the tillage zone of that farm. It's been tilled for forever. And then this is what you find right below it. And notice how difficult it is to break this apart. But if you go to, and Dan can do one here, but if you go, this is just common prairie. This has been in prairie for a long time, and you can see what happens when you, with those roots, what they've done to that soil. And this is ideally what we're looking for out of this system, is to get all of our soils like this down to 36 inches. And Dan pulled up another clump here. Now realize this is less than a month, and look at the amount of root growth that you've had. And these are very aggressive at shallow rooting, but very fine fibrous roots.
Thank you, Jim. It's really cool to see the soil structure, how that's changed, and it just looks very healthy, and your cover crop's already put on a lot of biomass, considering it's only been 3 weeks. That's really cool to see.
That's right.
Sam, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how, the wheat year and the wheat cover crop kind of fit into your rotation in general. So, what order do you do your crops in? And then, I don't know, are you seeing any sort of impact to the crop that's following the cover crop in terms of yield or just like the health of the crop?
Sure. Corn, soy, wheat, multi-species cover crop. Following the wheat, and then you go right back in with multi-species cover crop, go right back into corn, and then soybeans, and then wheat. 100% cover crop every year, though. That's important. But we use the fewer species. We'll use, for example, just rye and radish on this going into next year. The main thing is the rye and being able to control the weeds and specifically water hemp.
So have you seen any changes in your water hemp populations using this extended rotation plus cover crops every year?
Well, my point is that 3 years ago, we didn't have any. And under the system that we've been on, we've seen on the kind of the conventional beans, and they're not conventional. We've been putting them into a cover crop, but we have not been taking that cover crop all the way to the point of rolling it. And there's a crimper in my future, because Dan will confirm, he did this morning, that we've got to get this rye up to the point where we can crimp it instead of trying to terminate it at knee high. You just don't have enough biomass there, and as soon as you terminate it, then the weeds are going to start to germinate and come through. So yeah, we're looking at trying to reduce now the water hemp through the use of cover crop more intelligently. So it's the point I'm going to make is that first, this is a long-term process. I've been at this since 100% cover crop since 2015, but a multi-species cover crop since 2018. So this is the third year on a 1/3 division. This is the third year that we're having in this program. So each acre now has been treated by the multi-species, but it's only one rotation of that. We need at least 2 rotations before we really begin to collect the benefits from it. Yes, we can see improvements in the soil, but it's not something that you do and you walk out, 2 years later and say, wow, this is just nirvana. It's not quite that fast. We didn't put these soils in this condition of decarbonizing them over, just 10 years. We did it over multiple decades of about 70, 80 years. So we're not going to turn this around. But the point I will make is if you do the full regenerative program and add to it what Dan's done with the grazing, we begin to get that carbon back fairly quickly. I think the way I look at it is that if you're doing no-till, you're basically maintaining. If you add the cover crops 100% every year, you may get about 1/4% a year in improvement in soil organic matter. But if you add that grazing component, you'll double that again. And of course, that's what Dan's going to talk about.
All right, Jim, we're approaching kind of the end of your time section here, so I'd love for you to just share any closing thoughts you have with us before we do transition to Dan to chat a little bit more about the grazing component. And of course, I'd just like to remind everyone, if you've got questions for Jim, feel free to drop those in the chat box. We'll read them aloud to him so that he can answer them.
Okay, should we be walking back while I'm doing that? Because we want to get Dan now.
That sounds great.
Okay. Well, I guess I'm kind of sold and perhaps even an old hard-nosed guy at this point in time, but through a process of some years of looking at soils and thinking about how we're going to do this, what we do to the soils, I think, is pretty darn clear. This regenerative ag concept, I hope it never gets politicized. I'm afraid it might. But this regenerative ag process is where I think we have to go. And I mean that across all of agriculture. Do we have to put livestock on all that acreage? No, I don't think that's necessary. But at least we need to get the soil covered. We need to get living roots in that soil most of the year. And we can do that with 100% cover crop program on corn, soybean, ground, and a rotation. And the issue is if you add the wheat and that multi-species cover crop, you're going to improve your microbial colony much faster. So I think it's a thing that we have to do. And it's for each one of us to make the decision how we're going to go about incorporating that into our farming operation. But somehow, I think that has to be done. I've also come to the conclusion that it's not necessarily policy that is going to get us there. It's individual effort, and that individual effort, though, can be led. And my conclusion now is that foundations and organizations like PFI, that's where it's at. In fact, I will sincerely give accommodation to PFI. I think as I've looked from the policy perspective, as I looked across the landscape, they're not a policy organization. They're out there on the ground. They're teaching. People are learning, and that's exactly what we have to have. And I think PFI does it as well as any, and that's the reason why I became a member and wanted to be associated. So it's what individuals do, but we got to help individuals first identify that there's a problem. But once we know there's a problem, inform themselves, get knowledge, because you'll never change behavior until you can bring knowledge in and turn that knowledge into understanding. Once you get to the point where farmers understand why and what, then we begin to really make a difference on this issue. And I think it has to happen within the next 2 decades, or globally, we've got a fairly serious problems in terms of agricultural productivity.
Thank you, Jim, for that endorsement and a little bit of a pep for us to think about, the urgency of the issues that we're facing. And, we get our inspiration from farmers like you, so I'm happy to have you joining us today. But with that, let's go ahead and turn it to Dan. It looks like you've unmuted your phone, so that looks great.
I have.
Great, okay. And we can see you on camera, so excellent. Just to start with, Dan, why don't you give us a little bit of a brief introduction about who you are, where you farm. I know you've had a little bit of a journey with your practices, your cropping practices, so maybe you could talk us through briefly the history of, where you started and where you're at now.
Sure. Well, our history goes back and intersects Jim's through this agronomist. You mentioned Dave Swain back in the early 80s. My dad started Ridge-Till for a lot of the same reasons Jim did in 1983. It's what I grew up with. And I left the farm for a while and came back, and we transitioned to no-till in the early 90s. And we started using cover crops in the late 90s. And we've made the transition to organic on most of our acres now. So things evolve as we go. And as our understanding of the soil blossoms, that affects our management. And, I know we don't have a lot of time here today, but I want to hit on something I think is really important. Michael mentioned the 4 principles of soil health that they try to follow. We're obviously going to talk about a 5th one today with the value of ruminants, but I've listened through countless hours of mind-numbing, even for those passionate about soil health, discussion of what's soil health, how do we define it, how do we measure it. And I guess where I've come to now is I don't really want to talk about soil health anymore. I want to talk about soil functionality. And the reality is that before we started adulterating our soils, we had fully functional systems that could grow crops without inputs. And over time, we've depleted the soil's ability to do that to where we have dysfunctional soil that requires us to spoon feed the nutrients and provide the disease protection and the weed control. And that's good for some companies that sell product, but it's not so good for the farmer. So really, when we talk about organic and regenerative, what we're really talking about is building back soil functionality and having functional soils that can feed our plants without inputs. And, the other principle that we really believe in is that plants feed plants. We don't feed plants, plants feed plants. So with all that in mind, when you look at these 5 principles of soil health, I really think the one that's least understood, but probably is most vital to rebuilding functional soil, is diversity. Nowhere in nature do you see one species or even 2 or 3 species. The system was designed for multiple plants to work together. And so when we talk about practically how do we do that on the landscape, obviously putting wheat into rotation is one way that we can get a diverse plant mix to do us some good, because we've got enough growing season to to make that happen. And livestock is the other option or opportunity to monetize and be able to drive some cash flow off a year where we're really focused on diversity. So I just want to plant that seed that I think the way we can measure our soil health efforts is by how much of work our soils can do for us without us having to do for them. Having said that, we'll dive right in, because I know we don't have a lot of time. Can you bring up the first picture on my slides there? It's, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you all right. And we've got photos up. Are you able to see that on your end?
No. Oh, okay. Yeah, I see it in the bottom corner. Advance. You're showing a semi
Next slide,
right
Phoebe.
now. Yeah. Okay. That is was taken a year or two ago. That's one of our summer mixes, and that's probably a 12-way mixture there that is somewhere north of 5 tons of dry matter biomass. In that situation, we're going to graze that. But if you do the math on that, that's 10,000 pounds of feed out there. We don't want the cattle to eat all of it. Remember, what the above ground livestock don't eat, we leave behind for the below ground livestock. So our goal is to trample half of that and feed the soil, and the other half our animals consume. But even at that, that's 5,000 pounds. That's about 170 cow days worth of feed standing there. We value a cow day at about $1 a day. So that's $170 that we can generate from that. At the same time, building soil the fastest way we know how. I would love to see someone be able to tell me or give me a measure of what the below ground biomass that is, because the root structure to get plants that size is just phenomenal. Okay, next slide. So this is again some green season grazing we're doing. You can see where the animals have grazed and knocked down and created that mat, that mulch mat. And right now, across 4,000 acres that's in organic management, we've got that mat everywhere. And in no field do we have less than 4 species of plants growing. Some of those we put out there and some Mother Nature volunteered, but we feel like that we need diversity at all times, and this is a whole new thing. And to be certain, we've taken it on the chin in terms of grain yield in some places where we've been a little over ambitious, but that's how we learn. So we're moving forward. Next slide. Go ahead again.
Did you want to show
Okay,
any
no.
of the videos, or would you just like images for now?
Yeah, we can do some videos here in a minute. This is the one I really want to show, because for folks with cattle, the biggest expense they have is making hay to feed through the winter. And what you see here is yeah, there you go. What you see here is that same mix we showed during the green season. That's what it looks like as we're strip grazing it through the winter. And we actually grazed on that farm where that picture is taken. There's 225 acres there. And we grazed 200 mama cows and their calves throughout the entire winter. We started about the 1st of December, and we pulled them out of there at the end of March on that. So that was a very economical way for us to overwinter cattle. And let's not forget that these cattle, they're doing more than just eating and trampling. They're biological inoculators, mobile inoculators and fertilizers. And again, we don't really understand all that yet, but we know that what's coming out the back end of that cow really helps to stimulate the biology down below the soil surface. So we don't put a dollar amount on that, but we know it's real. We don't have enough long-term data on our farm to really talk numbers yet, but I know Dr. Alan Williams has done some studies down in Mississippi, which is a little different environment, but by just employing managed grazing, they were able to pick up about 1% of organic matter a year. I'm sure for us it's going to be something less than that. But even if it's half that or a third of that, that's phenomenal. We can make do a lot of great things in a fairly short amount of time in terms of soil. Okay, you can go to the, if you want to play one of the videos now. Keep going. Now, well, yeah, we're going backwards, it appears.
Some of the other videos are mixed in along the way, so I can
Yeah.
let you know when those
Okay.
come up.
So I'd like to remind you too that we can raise a cereal crop without harvesting the grain. And so on a lot of the photos you're going to see from our farm this year, that's what we did. It was a year or two transition field where Michael took these pictures. And so what we did is last fall, after the soybeans came off, we planted a cool season mixture, triticale, rye, flax. I don't know, there were probably at least 8 different plants in that. And then we grazed that 2 rounds this spring, and then we turned around and planted the warm season mix. And the pictures here from this year, the videos you're probably going to see are where we're making our first graze across that warm season mix this year. In that particular field, that'll be certified next year, so we'll probably graze it one more time around in another 30 days, hopefully a little less. And then we will go in there with another package, a legume-heavy package that we use ahead of corn, like vetch, clover, yellow blossom sweet clover. We'll have some radish and some oats, that type of thing in there to prepare for no-till organic corn next year. Another thing, this is kind of neither here nor there, but I think we need to lose the word rotation. That implies predictability. And what we really want to think about is plant sequences. Anytime you start to become predictable, you set yourself up for the next generation of weed pests, insect pests, and whatnot. What nature really likes is balance and diversity, and not anything that's predictable. So when we think about what's going to happen next, you know, if we have a goal in mind, say I want to raise corn 2 years from now, I'm going to start thinking about the plant sequences that we want to put out there today to start to prepare that land to be ready for corn 2 years from now. And that's a lot of fun, actually. It's made the game a lot more complex, but it's put some of the art back in farming. And I think that's something, if you talk to most farmers, that we miss. We've gotten into such a canned system, and we pay a dear price for that, because to play that game, we've got to purchase a lot of inputs. And if we can put our thinking hats back on and get creative, then we can eliminate a lot of that and have a very much higher value added crop that's more nutrient dense, and we're helping build soil at a really fast clip simultaneously. I've lost the pictures. I don't know where we're at on that. How are we doing on time?
We're pulling them up again, and I think we've got a few more minutes. Maybe you could just tell us about, I mean, I know that you just told us that you don't necessarily like the word rotation, but, you know, tell us about how grazing fits into your crop rotation. Are you grazing all of your cover crops or just after wheat?
No, in fact, where you saw us grazing this year is one where we had small grains. We had rye and triticale, not actually wheat, but, you know, again, I think we have to start to think as a prescription on any individual field. If we've got a certain weed pressure or something that we want to correct or fix, that or just accelerate. I mean, that's really what the cattle bring to this. The 4 principles stand alone, but what the livestock are is the accelerator. It's pouring the gas on the fire. It's making things happen a lot faster than we can with just plants. In our system, though, plants are also a plan B a lot of times. If we have a crop like 2 years ago, we planted wheat after cereal rye ahead of soybeans. And the cereal rye, when we roll it, we don't kill all of it. There's some volunteer, and as Jim alluded to earlier, that can be a problem with our buyers. And we knew that we had too much volunteer rye in there to go to a conventional market. So, we made cattle feed out of that. We made wheatlage. They just give you a lot more options and flexibility to respond to Mother Nature. And, in the old days, with no-till and just cover crops before we went organic, I could tell you in January how everything was going to go, what I was going to do on every field, and probably get within 10% of our ultimate yield and our net profit per acre before we ever planted the crop. Today, I can't do that because we start out with plan A, but a lot of times we end up on D, E, or F before we're done. And that's another value of the livestock in this system, is to give us that flexibility.
Thanks, Dan. I think that was really insightful about the importance of livestock in the system. Do you have any closing thoughts? And folks that are attending, if you have any questions, please go ahead and add those to the chat box so that we can ask them of Dan. But Dan, why don't you share any closing thoughts that you have, and then we're going to transition to Alicia to speak a little bit about some of the economics of growing small grains.
Yeah, well, this goes a little bit to economics. In 2017, if you go dig out the Monsanto annual report before they were purchased by Bayer, and you took all their profits from ag operations, and you divide that by the total number of acres of corn, soybeans, and cotton grown in this country. Obviously, they don't have 100% market share, but just bear with me here. They netted $30 an acre on each of those acres across the whole nation. In the same year, in the state of Illinois, where they've got a really commonly used record system that gives nice baseline data, the average farmer lost $40 an acre. What we want to do, and that's because we're addicted to those products, and what we want to do is turn that on its end. We want to recreate functional soil, rebuild functional soil, and create food that is healthier, more nutrient dense, that consumers actually want. I think the future has never been brighter. If anything, as COVID has come along, it's really increased our beef that we're sold out through February now. There's just so much opportunity for young farmers. I have 3 sons that are just starting in their farming careers. And, I think the regenerative concepts that we've talked about today are the only path I see that gives a lot of hope for the next generation. So I really am excited for them and excited about the changes we're seeing in the soil. Every time we go out and dig, it just, the hits just keep on coming. So I think pay attention to the principles, the principles apply everywhere. How you use them and mold them into a system that works for you and your management and your climate and your soils is going to look different on every farm. But, every decision we make is within the context of those principles. And I think if folks concentrate on that, they'll have good results.
Awesome, Dan. Thanks so much. That was awesome. I'm just really inspired to think about how we can re-envision the future of agriculture to, better serve the people who are making it happen and consumers. So thank you very much. At this point, Alicia, I'd ask you to go ahead and start your screen share. Of course, as Dan and Jim alluded to, sometimes the economics of cover crops can be not always on the most positive side. And so Alicia's going to tell us a little bit about what she's observed from multiple farmers.
Great. And can you see my slideshow and presentation mode?
It looks great. Yep.
Perfect. Wonderful. Excellent. Well, when I started first talking to Joe and Michael about putting on this field day, I think it was Joe who made a comment that in Indiana, some people like to call wheat poverty grass because of some of these challenges that we've talked about, like when we were looking at Jim's budget of just the inputs going into the wheat and then the money coming in from the grain sale. It doesn't pencil out very neatly. And frankly, in all of the sort of across the Midwest, the states where we're we're working to kind of rebuild the network and infrastructure and markets for a small grain crop, whether that's wheat or barley or oats or anything like that. That's sort of the similar issue for everyone.
Hey, Alicia, sorry, I'm going to pause you. For some reason, your PowerPoint is no longer in presentation mode.
Okay.
There you go. Okay, back on.
Interesting. All right. And so when we started working with farmers and with markets to try to get more buyers for small grains crops, to make it more feasible for farmers to practice these longer rotations, add in that flexibility, add in that diversity, we really found out that we needed to know more about the economics, right, of how this system works out in order to make this feasible for more farmers to take the plunge and implement this rotation in ways like Jim and Dan are doing. And so the budgets that I'm going to talk about today are largely with oats as the small grain crop, but a lot of the concepts that we discovered when we started looking at these budgets and information from real farmers who are practicing these rotations are applicable kind of no matter what small grain you're adding into that rotation, if it's wheat. And so what we've discovered when we started working with growers to, kind of study these crop rotations was that there were really 3 keys to looking at the cash flow and the budgets in these crop rotations with small grains to, really take a full accounting of the value that we're bringing to this system. And so we saw that small grains are profitable when we consider the co-products, cut back on input costs, and then count the whole rotation. And so with these kind of 3 shifts in the way that we're thinking about the profitability and economics of small grains, we can start to see the green, I guess, in money terms, as well as the cover crop being out there. So that first item, consider the co-products, is, oh, okay, I'll stop 1 second. I'm getting ahead of myself. And so one of the key things that we discovered when we were looking at these rotations and working with the farmers was that, one of the big benefits that a small grain brings to the row table, right, is the earlier harvest date. And so the most successful farmers who were making sort of the most impact on their bottom line were really strategically using this longer window for cover crops, right? So whether that's for, Jim's talked a lot about his goals of diversity, and Dan is using that for livestock feed to grow that big multi-species cover crop mix. We're really thinking about ways to put that big gap after that small grain harvest, like wheat around the 4th of July, to use, because we've got a couple more months of nice hot growing weather in order that we can play around with our cover crop a little bit more and accomplish more of our goals. And so that's kind of also one of the foundations of what we found here, was that strategic thinking about that cover crop to meet those goals. So the first item, again, as I said on my sort of list of 3, the 3 keys, is consider the co-products. And so what we found when we looked at these budgets was that, in fact, for this farmer who was growing oats and corn compared to kind of a soybean corn budget from his same county, was that this farmer was coming out ahead, about $170 per acre in those 2 years of their crop rotation as compared to the corn and soybean rotation. And the way that he was able to do this is that the first thing was this, count the co-products. So he was able to diversify those revenue streams. So when we take a snapshot of just sort of like the revenue coming out of the corn soybean rotation compared to the oat corn rotation, we see that, it's mostly grain coming out of that corn and soybean rotation. However, with a small grain in there, we have some more options for these other, revenue streams. And so this particular farmer was also harvesting straw from that crop, that small grain crop. And then as well, he had established an underseeding of clover with the oats, and then had taken a cutting of clover hay off of that stand of clover. So using it again as that livestock forage in the fall, in September. And so he was driving more of that, those revenue streams to generate more revenue in that first year. Because as we saw with kind of Jim's budget, it is difficult to pencil out, all of the inputs going into wheat and then just the sale of the grain. So it's important to think about these other revenue streams that are that the small grain is kind of bringing to the table with the opportunity that it provides. And so again, I don't think we can emphasize this enough. I mean, and Dan will be a better advocate for this than I ever will, but the importance of livestock in this system is, you know, brings a lot of potential value to the table in terms of the economics as well. And I think, is my video spotlighted?
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. I've still got a green box around somebody else's screen, so perfect. So this is sort of the first step on the journey to thinking about small grains as profitable crops, is really thinking about all of the different revenue streams that we have in that year that are brought to the table by having that early harvested small grain and its co-products. So the second item is one that Dan mentioned also a lot, and that's cutting back on input costs. So using sort of mimicking of natural diversity by adding more crops into our rotations to really kind of drive some of the biology that we need to cut back on having to use so many pesticides, so many herbicides, fertilizers, that type of thing. And so again, what we saw with farmers who were kind of successfully monitoring the cash flow in these extended rotations was, you know, really flipping the switch in that corn soybean rotation from having lots of added inputs that they were purchasing to really only applying some manure for fertilizer in this farmer's case. And then also, you know, reducing those herbicide costs. So if you look down to the herbicide lines, we can see that sort of the average county comparison would be spending about $50 on herbicide products. And then but for the, you know, corn following the small grain with that cover crop, because we're getting that biological weed suppression, they were able to cut the number of products that they were applying as well. And so that really, you know, kind of is another way to kind of think about the revenues that are, or it's really not revenue, but sort of avoided costs that we're having when we are really maximizing all of the benefits that are brought to the table by the small grain and the cover crop. And so this data comes from the Marsden Farm Trials, which is located in Ames or Boone, Iowa, central Iowa, but really looks at sort of the inputs and outcomes across several different long-term cropping system trials. And here, one of the things that they studied and looked at and have published on is really the need for herbicides in these rotations. And they see that in going from a 2-year to a 3-year rotation, they were able to use 33% less herbicide products for the same level of weed control. And then going from a 2-year to a 4-year rotation, where they were having a year of hay or alfalfa in that rotation as well, they were able to cut those herbicide products by 50%. So this just kind of is, you know, another point of data to support what we were already seeing with some of the successful farmers, that they were really leveraging that biological pest control to reduce the number of products they had to purchase. And another way that a lot of farmers that we work with, you know, maybe who don't have access to livestock, they're maybe more in Jim's position where they don't have a herd, they're not ready to get into livestock at sort of the later stage of their farming life, is that they can really try to think then more strategically about using that cover crop to reduce their fertilizer input needs. And so this farmer is one that we work with, located in Iowa, who, you know, has this quote saying, "Incorporating more legumes into my rotation lets me cut back on end fertilizer rates." And he had the question about how much could he actually reduce his fertilizer rates. And so what he did was set up a strip trial and compared some different rates of fertilizer application that was after he had a clover cover crop after a rye crop, and then a field that was a rye crop and then fallow. It didn't have any cover crop after it. And so then compared the yields of these different nitrogen rates applied to these different cover crop treatments. And what he found was that between the field that had that clover cover crop, he was able to apply 100 pounds of nitrogen nutrient in the fertilizer, and that had statistically the same yield as the applications of 140 to 190 pounds to that no clover treatment. So by using this clover cover crop in the absence of livestock to really drive down the costs of that fertilizer application to the corn, he was able to avoid applying up to 90 pounds of N nutrient as fertilizer to this field. And so both these examples of reducing that herbicide expense to the corn, as well as reducing that fertilizer expense to the corn, are good ways to, other ways to sort of reduce those costs that can make the cash flow work for these extended crop rotations. And so then the last point in sort of this flipping the script on thinking about economics in an extended rotation is to really count the whole rotation. And so when we look at this farmer's budget that we've kind of been studying as we've gone through this presentation, we see that this particular farmer, by having livestock and being able to take a straw cutting and then add manure to replace those nutrients and, you know, kind of do all of these things, he was able to actually generate more revenue off of his oat year than his soybean year, which I would say is kind of unusual, to be fair. Sometimes instead what we saw when we looked at these budgets was something that looked a little bit more like this. Where the oat year, by having those lower revenues, maybe they didn't want to harvest that straw or wanted to leave that cover crop out there, you know, for the diversity and the biomass and adding to that soil organic matter. They might have carried kind of a loss in that oat year in terms of there's more expense going into that cover crop, into manure, into growing that small grain than they're generating by selling the grain or other co-products. However, even in these cases, what we saw was that with good practices of reducing those expenses to the following corn crop, these farmers actually came out even more profitable by, you know, about, let's see if I can do quick math here, you know, $70, $80, because of, you know, even though they carried that loss in the oat year of just kind of expending more towards preparing for that corn year, they were generating a little bit more revenue there, as well as potentially capitalizing on a bit of a yield bump in that corn crop because it was in this extended rotation. And so that's also a really important thing to think about, is that, you know, if you take this narrow sort of 1 year snapshot of a rotation, you're probably not capturing the full effect of that crop. And particularly in the case of small grains, because it allows us to have that strategic window to do great things with that cover crop, you know, you do really have to look throughout the years of the rotation at the profitability across multiple years to get a full picture of the benefit that that small grain is bringing to the table. And so to summarize, we really, you know, saw when we worked with farmers and, you know, took this data from what they were seeing happening on their farms, that these, again, were sort of these 3 key points to really thinking about profitability of a small grain crop. And to repeat those, they were considering those co-products, cutting back on the input costs across the rotation, and then also counting that whole rotation. So counting the benefit of that small grain year in rotation that it brings to the table. And so I also wanted to mention a little bit about market options here as well, because this is one of the things that PFI has been doing a bit of work on and organizing to try to connect more farmers with markets and create more markets for small grain crops. And as Jim said, you know, kind of earlier in his presentation, you know, wheat pricing is different. Like it's just a little bit different. And so I did want to just touch on a couple of key things that we've learned and observed with these markets, just so that we're kind of setting everybody up for success, at least with what we've learned so far. And so with a food grade market, as Jim was saying, he went for this food grade market last year. Usually the specifications for the grain are stricter for food markets, right? The feed markets that you might be selling to. And so for wheat, the really key sort of market grain specification that causes the most problems is the level of VOM or DON in the grain, which is caused by a fusarium head blight infection while the grain is growing. And so the biggest things that you can do while the grain is in the field, right, while the crop is in the field, is when to manage for that aspect of you know, the grain quality. And that is by getting a cultivar manure that is more resistant to fusarium head bite or scab. And then also, you know, monitoring some of the tools that are available to know if you're at high risk for a fusarium head blight infection, and then potentially applying a fungicide if that fits with your management system, to avoid those high DON levels that might cause you to only be able to access a feed market instead of a food market. And then the other specification that can cause some issues is just this test weight in small grains. And that's caused, we get low test weight if it gets really hot during the grain fill in most of the small grains. But for wheat, that's less of a concern than with some of the crops like oats. You know, test weight is a much bigger issue. So those would be some things to look out for if you have designs on a food grade market for these crops. And even if you do have designs on a feed grade market, right, that VOM or DON level can potentially be problematic as well, because if you are feeding it, especially if you're feeding it, you know, on your own farm or something like that, you need to be aware of those DON levels, because it can cause animal health issues if it's not diluted or a binding agent is fed with it. So still important to think about those VOM and DON levels in the grain, even if it is for feed. And you might potentially get a DOC fee, you know, a DOC on your bid price. All right, so I also wanted to make everybody aware just quickly, I know we're kind of running up here on the end of our time, that PFI does offer a cost share program to grow a small grain crop, followed by a cover crop like Jim is doing. And actually Jim is a participant in this cost share program. I don't know if that's specifically the field that we've been in today that we've been working with him on to supply this cost share, but it provides $25 an acre to plant this system of a small grain with a cover crop into their crop rotation. And you can enroll up to 100 acres. And we are getting geared up next Friday, so a week from tomorrow, to be launching the 2021 sign up. So if you have designs on planting winter wheat, we can, you know, may potentially make this extra support available for you. And that's an option for farmers in Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Ohio. Any farmers located in those state boundaries can make use of this cost share program. So that's another opportunity to kind of help and support on this economics and market side, since we know it's not the easiest to do. So with that, that's kind of what I had prepared to talk about today as far as economics, shared a little bit of what we've learned so far, and hopefully set you up for a little bit more of success with your small grain crops.
Thank you so much, Alicia, for that really speedy and detailed overview of how small grains can be profitable. So as Alicia mentioned, we're kind of running up on our time here. However, I would just like to ask a question of Dan. Tate Carlson of Storm Lake asked, do you have any experience with stacking other livestock into your extended rotation and grazing of cover crop? And Dan, we don't have you unmuted yet. Oh, there you go.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you now. Thank you. Yep.
Okay. So we do not have experience. My oldest son is our livestock guy, and he came back to the farm, and we started a 200 head cow herd, and let's just say that's kept him plenty busy so far. After college, he worked on a farm that was 10 different species of animals, had their own on-farm abattoirs and whatnot. So he's had exposure to that, and we've got hopes of getting there someday, but not yet. Sorry. I think there's tremendous potential, though, especially when you start to find species that are not competitive but additive, like chickens. You know, one of the farms I was on in Australia was using cattle followed by chickens to rehabilitate soil at an incredible rate. Within 2 years, they just transformed the soil. So I think there's a lot of potential there. One of the challenges is, particularly when you get into the poultry and whatnot, is it's very labor intensive. Where he worked in Georgia, they had an endless supply of minimum wage labor. Where we operate out of here in Indiana, West Central Indiana, it's hard to find anybody that will show up for work every day for less than $20 an hour. It's hard to support that. But we certainly think there's a lot of potential there, and we hope to put more effort into that down the road.
Thanks, Dan. All right, it is 1 o'clock Central, 2 o'clock Eastern. So I just want to say thank you again to Dan, Jim, and Alicia for presenting today, and also to Joe and Michael on helping to facilitate, and Phoebe. So just so you know, if you didn't catch all the excellent details of this presentation, it was recorded and it will be posted on Practical Farmers YouTube page probably next week sometime. So you can check that out for future reference if you'd like. And again, this is just my last plug. Please take the time to fill out the evaluation once you exit the webinar, just so PFI can continue to improve our programming. And that's it for today. Thanks everyone for attending. I hope you take care and be well.